experiences are very common, okay? So 3% of children have experienced the death of a parent before age 17, and this varies, by part of the country, by racial ethnic group, by socioeconomic status. That same point is true across these adversities. We see 7% of children have a parent who spent time in jail, 9% of children have witnessed community violence. And these are all reports coming from the mother. I wanted to give a little bit, and I'd also like to make the point that about 25% of children have experienced 2 or more of these adversities that we categorize within this subset. And these adversities tend to cluster within individuals. I'm going to just present a little bit of data on violence exposures in particular, since I know that's very relevant to the conversation today. This is data coming from the National Survey of Children's Exposure to Violence, published in 2012 in JAMA Pediatrics. And you can see here that about 1/3 of children had experienced any physical assault in the past year. These reports come from parents for children 9 and under, and they asked the youth themselves for those 10 and above. And you can see that 9% experienced assault that was accompanied by with an injury. 15% had reports of parental maltreatment, and 25% witnessed some kind of violence, with 18% witnessing violence in their own community. And we can only imagine, this is a national estimate, so you can imagine how different this looks when you think about neighborhood context variations that we see across the country. I wanted to just pull up one example to really make this point about how different the patterning looks based on individual level characteristics like race or socioeconomic status. So just taking the example of a child having a parent removed from the home to serve time in jail. So we see that Black or Hispanic children are nearly twice as likely to have that experience. And we see very dramatic patterning of this adverse exposure based on socioeconomic status as well. So 17% of children who are considered to be below the federal poverty line have this adverse exposure, which we know is correlated with so many other negative things. We also know that these patterns are further complex based on immigrant status. So really the takeaway from the data that I'm presenting here is to make the point that these national estimates that we give, of 7% of children really mask a lot of very important information for the communities that people here may be working with or developing laws around. And this is all really important for us to be thinking about. So with that information in mind, I'm going to address the second objective of my presentation, which is to provide a little bit of data about how childhood trauma may affect health across the life course. And I'm focusing on health, but we can imagine that everything that I'm talking about today also extends to the world of education, but that's not the literature I'll draw on. So I just we'll spend a few moments talking about a short background on the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which I'm not sure how many people in the room are familiar with, but it's really a fundamental study which shaped a whole field of research that's occurred over the past 20 years. So the purpose of this Adverse Childhood Experience Study was to take a look at the possible health and social consequences of childhood experiences over the life course. This was a collaboration between the CDC and Kaiser Permanente Healthcare. It was led by Vince Felitti. And what they did is they enrolled over 17,000 individuals who were part of that HMO, and they asked them a series of questions about their childhood experiences related to the domains that you see listed on this slide. So that's abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, okay? So there are these series of questions, and then they correlated this information. They created a summary score and correlated that with information from the medical health record and looked at how these experiences predicted health that happened in childhood, predicted health outcomes much later in life. And this was considered to be a groundbreaking study because what they found were very, very consistent patterns across a huge range of behaviors and outcomes, which generated a vast amount of interest and made this people think about childhood experiences as a major public health issue. So I'm going to present some data, and you're going to see this very consistent pattern of a dose-response relationship. So first I'm presenting ACEs and what we categorize as mental health or health behaviors, and you see for smoking you have double the odds, for severe obesity 1.6 times the odds in the highest risk category. Depression 4.6 times the odds, ever attempting suicide 12 times the odds among those with the highest number of adverse childhood experiences compared to those with none. When we shift to high-risk behaviors, we see the exact same pattern for individuals identifying as an alcoholic, using illicit drugs, 4 times the odds, using injection drugs, and ever having an STI. So as you see again, this very consistent pattern across a huge range of health behaviors. And what was really surprising to people was how these patterns extended to not only these behavioral things that were somewhat consistent with our general schemas about how childhood adversity affected health, but also to chronic diseases, which are have the largest burden of cost for society. So we see childhood adversity was associated with double the odds of ischemic heart disease. This is controlling for education, for example, and race. Cancers, double the odds of cancer. Stroke, as well as chronic bronchitis or emphysema. So it really changed people's mindsets, because how often is it that we're talking about something like bronchitis and emphysema and think back to someone's childhood, right? So this really shaped the course of a whole field of study. And so just to take a moment to say where we are now, that study came out in 1998, and almost 20 years have passed, and people have been doing a lot of work to try to unpack these associations and understand what are some of the pathways, and also understand, this study took a very crude look at these childhood adversities, and people are trying to dig deeper to understand how accumulation might matter, chronicity, severity, how different types of stressors may impact different outcomes differently. I've been more involved in some of the research to try to understand mechanisms. And one mechanism that has come forward as a top contender for understanding how these childhood experiences could affect such a broad range of outcomes is inflammation. So when we think about how these adverse childhood experiences are embedded physiologically to affect this broad range of outcomes, people sometimes think about this construct of inflammation. So inflammation is a physiological process that is part of our normal stress response system. So we heard a little bit from Dr. Lee about how when stress happens, cortisol goes up, there's a cascade effect where this can result in elevated levels of inflammation. So elevated levels are adaptive in the short term, but when levels stay high, it's maladaptive over time and can present a risk for creating physiological dysregulation across a vast range of bodily systems. And these mechanisms are thought to potentially link these childhood traumatic experiences to a wide range of health over the life course. And we now have evidence about the role of inflammation for many chronic diseases, as well as mental health outcomes like depression. Okay? So, and people have really begun to do the basic science, which I won't get into today, to outline how the potential biological and behavioral mechanisms by which response to childhood trauma leads to this chronic inflammatory state that we know predicts diseases. And once this, some of these processes happen, they can even create a loop where these elevated levels of inflammation may influence things like eating behaviors or likelihood of substance abuse. Inflammation can interrupt sleep processes, and they can also, we know that they're associated with different forms of psychopathology. Okay, so one area that I've been involved in research that I'm not going to go into a lot today is when these elevated levels of inflammation may happen. And I worked on a systematic review as well as some empirical research where we're able to see that looking across the existing literature, you can see dysregulated levels of inflammation as early as childhood in response to traumatic events. So it's very early in the life course that things become interrupted. And so as someone who is highly disturbed by thinking about children having experiences early in life that put them on this trajectory for poor health over the life course, I'm really interested in what are the possibilities for social interventions that could interrupt the possibility of these negative health consequences following trauma. And that's going to be the third point that I'm going to talk about today. So I'm briefly going to go over a study that I worked on that basically was a systematic review article to try to see what the literature tells us about the possibilities to promote physiological improvements in stress response physiology. So I'm going to talk about a study we published in Pediatrics. And for this study, we scanned the literature to identify all studies that exist that were either quasi-experimental studies or randomized control studies that were designed to improve either in child's relationships, environments, or psychosocial functioning that looked at cortisol as an outcome. So they all randomly assigned children to either receive an intervention or not and looked at the changes that it had on their biology. And within these studies, there's a subset that focus on some of the traumatic exposures that we think about, or we're thinking about today. So some of the studies looked at children who had been in the foster care system or were designed to help children who had experienced maltreatment, high-risk families, meaning there was a parent with a mental illness or substance abuse problems, or children experiencing parental death. And what we found is that of these 19 studies that existed at the time we did this report, at least 18 out of the 19 studies noticed at least one change in cortisol in response to these social interventions, suggesting there's this plasticity to the stress response system that can respond positively with an intervention. The best evidence came from the 8 studies that had a low-risk comparison group. So children who had never experienced a trauma. So there was a comparison happening between children who had the trauma, who got the intervention, children who had a trauma, no intervention, and then this low-risk group that had not had that exposure. And in all of these studies, they were able to show that the post-intervention cortisol in the intervention group was more similar to the low-risk comparison group, which was really good evidence given the complexities that we heard about earlier about how cortisol varies over the course of development. So we were able to conclude that cortisol activity appears to be able to be altered by interventions, which is really encouraging news. And it shows that there's it may be possible to repair stress response systems after trauma or other adversities. And obviously we have a lot more work to do to understand nuances of this and thinking about how one might be able to scale programs up to reach entire communities that may be experiencing trauma. I wanted to end with one other positive note. There's more and more work coming out about the possibilities of interventions for children who have experienced trauma. And how we might interrupt, the negative health consequences. And what I'm showing you here is a slide from a study that came out just last week that's looking at the impact of a family-centered prevention intervention program. The setting is rural Georgia, African-American families, poor African-American families. And what they were able to show is that this intervention program was able to basically, among those families who received this intervention, it prevented seeing a positive association between adverse childhood experiences and pre-diabetes at the age of 25 years. So these families had a brief intervention at the age of 11, and at age 25 you can no longer see a positive association between adverse childhood experiences and risk for pre-diabetes at 25. So there's some encouraging evidence that there are things we can do. With that, I'll just say that this field of research has a long way to go. Some of the priorities are to identify the mechanisms, sensitive periods. We didn't talk today about how timing matters, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest timing for the exposures really may have an impact on the consequences we see. We have to learn about those sensitive periods, as well as moderators. There's also research showing how, individuals experience traumas within different contexts, and neighborhood can shape the impact of, let's say, household traumas on long-term consequences. And building on this information, ideally we'll be able to develop more age-appropriate interventions that can lead to the reduction in disease risk and health disparities, as well as the intergenerational transmission of these disparities as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Slopen, and thank you for giving us a message of hope at the end of your talk there. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Susan Espelin, who is a licensed psychologist trained in developmental and clinical psychology at the University of Chicago, with a diploma in clinical psychology from the American Board of Professional Psychology. She has served on the faculties of Montclair State, Rutgers, and the New Jersey University of Medicine and Dentistry, UMDNJ. Dr. Espelin has also testified as an expert in criminal and family court and civil matters. Critically, given her expertise on child abuse, she was part of a faculty that developed and taught a decade-long course sponsored by Rutgers School of Social Work and the New Jersey Department of Children and Families that trained psychologists and psychiatrists to function as expert evaluators in child protection matters. She is also a past president of the New Jersey chapter of the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, and has been the primary investigator on several service grants related to child abuse. So please help me welcome Dr. Espelin.
Good morning. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. Friends in the audience. I'm going to be talking a bit about trauma today and trying to put it into a social context and making use, hopefully, of all of the biological material that you heard today in understanding what we're talking about. So I want to start with this issue of recognition of trauma in schools or elsewhere, and I think generally most people have in their mind when they think about trauma acute events, a single event. Hurricane Sandy, a murder in a family, a range of acute events. And those kind of traumatic experiences behaviorally often produce what look like anxiety reactions, fear, nightmares, sleep disturbances, the like. But what we're often talking about that gets missed, I think, is this more chronic picture, this chronic trauma, this chronic stress, and what that looks like. And that often looks somewhat different. What we see particularly is huge problems in what we call affect regulation. Children get upset easily and they can't calm themselves down. Problems with impulse control, often connected to affect dysregulation, where they're distressed and now they lash out at somebody else or themselves, or they run out of the room. A lot of this is what, kind of repetition of flight, fight kinds of responses. So running out of a classroom is a flight response. Fighting with somebody, assaulting somebody is a fight response. It may seem huge compared to whatever the trigger is, but these are trauma kinds of responses that have been ingrained over and over again, as has been discussed. Problematic self-soothing, the absence of being able to calm oneself down when one is distressed. Flattening of affect, that is that generally they're not terribly well in touch with the feelings that they have, and their affective responses without being triggered are often quite minimized. And what we call proactive aggression, which I'm going to talk about a little bit in a minute. This article discusses this issue of proactive aggression, really, in the context of continuous traumatic stress. See, one of the problems we have in the field as mental health providers is when we get a kid after an acute traumatic event, there are a lot of techniques that are useful for helping that child. But if the child's life is in the middle of continuous traumatic stress, there is no safe place in which to bring down this heightened arousal. And so we're often dealing with a problem where children are constantly living in traumatic or highly stressful situations. And this particular author talks about how that's often, we need to understand it in the kind of social, political, institutional context of racism and poverty, where there's a historical trauma, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a minute. And accompanying that in these communities, high levels of violent crime. And even if you're not a direct victim of such crime, or don't know somebody who was directly victimized, everybody in the community is affected by that high level of crime. There's a chronic level of tension in communities where that is going on. Very hard to calm people down from that when there's real events happening. And often individuals present with a somewhat different looking diagnostic picture. That is, he makes the point that is frequently less sympathetic. So if we get a kid or an adult in who's having nightmares and telling you they're afraid to leave the house and so forth, we can empathize with that. The helper can empathize with that. But it's much more difficult when anger and hostility is the dominant picture, is the dominant presentation. Then we kind of all want to back off, and it's harder to empathize with the source of that, which is fear, terror, panic. Okay, so in the school setting, a lot of the behaviors that we see, in my opinion, get misinterpreted diagnostically as ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, which, then that's related to the whole school to prison pipeline, if the kids are seen as having conduct disorder. And my particular peeve, and I have to say this is about bipolar disorder, because there's this whole thing that's gone on in the mental health community in the last 20 years, where there's this notion that every time a child has a rage reaction, that is an indicator in childhood of manic behavior 20 years down the road. And in fact, the long-term research does not support that. The kids who have those problems and are not treated do go on to have problems in adulthood, but they don't become bipolar. So I just want to put that one out there, because the medications used for those kids are heavy-duty medications that, from what I can tell, nobody really knows what's going to happen with those kids with those meds. So the central question when we're seeing all these behavioral issues, which are real, okay, is not what's wrong with this person, but what's happened to this person. What has this child experienced that is creating this situation? Now I want to shift from here to just a discussion, and it's a very brief discussion, about this whole question of oppression. 8 years ago, was that long ago? 2009, right? 8 years ago, I attended a training that I've now taken 15 times. It's called Undoing Racism. And if anybody has an opportunity to take this, I would really recommend that you take it. Because it gives you a historical lens, a current lens, an intrapsychic lens, a legal lens. It gives you a multidisciplinary lens on this problem of racism in our society that's so deeply entrenched. And the full title of the training is Undoing Racism and Community Organizing, which I'm going to talk about just a tiny bit at the very end, because that's about what to do, not just how to understand, but what to do, okay? So one thing that we know, and this has been, Dr. Slopen was discussing, youth from non-dominant, and I'm using that word because I hate the word minority. That's one of the things I learned from my training, this Undoing Racism training. The word minority connotes not as important as. We don't have to pay as much attention to them, right? And in fact, in many of the communities that we're talking about, the people from the oppressed groups are in the great majority. They're not in the minority. So this is a word that I've systematically taken out of my vocabulary in this context. So youth from non-dominant oppressed groups are at increased risk for interpersonal trauma exposure and adverse childhood experiences. We also have this question of historical trauma that I want to talk about. And I want to make the point a little bit more that living with chronic stress, even if it doesn't reach a traumatic level, is difficult and makes recovery from any acute traumatic event that much more difficult. Okay, so I want a couple of words about historical trauma. It means that the responses to the trauma experienced by past generations, through parental behavior, but maybe through epigenetic factors too, okay, impact a new generation who has not necessarily directly experienced that trauma. The term, in my knowledge, first came into really prevalence with regard to the European Holocaust situation, right? Where we had people who went through a 12-year period of traumatic experiences, are now living, let's say, in this country, relatively free from trauma. And one of the things that's interesting about that particular population, when they became parents here, they hardly talked about what had happened to them. In most of those families that were studied, the kids knew that the parents had been involved in the Holocaust, but they didn't have the details of the experience. The parents themselves were so traumatized they didn't want to talk about it. But what happened was that, at least in the first generation, the kids began to demonstrate a lot of traumatic kinds of symptoms, fears, avoidance behavior. So the question is, how does that happen? How does it go from a parent, without the kid knowing the details, the kid picking up these kind of behaviors? Now, this issue of intergenerational trauma has also now been discussed in the literature with respect to the Native American population in this country and the African American population in this country. And there's a woman by the name of Joy Leary. Anybody know who she is? Okay. She's another phenomenal speaker if you ever have an opportunity to hear her speak. And this is her book that she wrote is called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And what she talks about, and I'll give you a vignette from the book, is the differences in parenting based on historical trauma. So she says, if you have a black mom with a preschool child in the bank, and a white mom with a preschool child in the bank, and obviously this is not true for all black moms and all white moms, but she's making a point. Where is the black child with respect in proximity to the mom, and where is the white child in proximity to the mom? And her point is that generally the black child is right near the mother, because the mother is not allowing the child to explore, to run around, to sit on furniture over there, what have you. And she's arguing that that's a legacy of the slave and Jim Crow experience, of knowing that their children, first of all, would be in tremendous danger if they didn't stay put, okay, if they didn't really stay and listen, and that the mother would be immediately judged as deficient if the child was running around. Now, it's not that every black mother who does this is thinking about slavery. She's thinking about the safety of her child and herself. The issue I have with calling this intergenerational trauma is because a lot of that is still happening, right? So we're not necessarily living with Jim Crow, but we're living with racial profiling and school to prison pipeline and so forth. So it's not like it's past and now we're just perpetuating it. It's very much in the present as well. I want to switch off of this into just talking a little bit about poverty. And I want to make the point that, well, I think there was another term that was used for it earlier, but I'm going to call it concentrated poverty. And that's generally defined in the literature as living in an area where 30% or more of the population is living at the poverty line or below. So in the United States right now, the 2017 poverty line for a family of 4 is $24,600. And if you're living in a community where 30% or more are living at that level, then you're living in concentrated poverty, whether or not your family meets those criteria. And of course, we know that twice that level is considered low income. So in Newark, for example, and I think some of those stats are on the handout here, huge numbers of kids in Essex County, and particularly in Newark, East Orange, Irvington, are living in concentrated poverty as well as in poverty. And the question is, what is it that happens in areas of concentrated poverty that is additionally stressful to being just, I mean, I hate to say just poor, but being poor and then living in a neighborhood like that? And what we have is higher rates of victimization, so that comes with higher exposure to trauma. What's interesting is if you actually look at the data, higher levels of other sources of trauma, more fires in homes, more pedestrian accidents on the streets. When I drive down South Orange Avenue from my home in South Orange to Newark, and I do that regularly, almost to kind of remind myself Driving is a whole different experience, right? People stop actually in crosswalks when they're driving in South Orange, right? So people can cross the street. So, we have higher levels of other sources of trauma. And here's what's really important. While there are more poor white people in the United States just numerically, black people experience not just higher rates of poverty, but higher rates of concentrated poverty, all right? Because we have a pattern of racial segregation in housing that has a legal history and is really entrenched. So this is just a slide to show you concentrated poverty in different, that's a few years old, but in different metropolitan areas. So the green line is the percentage of white people who are poor, not other white people, poor white people, the percentage who are living in concentrated poverty. The purple line shows you the percentage of poor blacks living in concentrated poverty. So take a look at Chicago, for example. Turns out all three of us have some connection to Chicago. Take a look at Chicago. 35% of the poor black people are living in neighborhoods with this concentrated poverty. Less than 5% of the poor white people. That doesn't mean there's a lot of poor white people in Chicago, but they're not living in concentrated poverty. That really makes a difference in terms of trauma and resources and a range of things in people's lives that make life more or less stressful. Okay, and then I just want to talk about racism itself, in addition to how it plays out the way I just described, in terms of chronic stress. So I would argue, and a number of people have, not just me, that even if you're not living, you haven't experienced life-threatening trauma, the presence of regular discrimination and profiling is an example of chronic stress. This whole issue of black families, black parents having the talk with their kids when they get a driver's license, and the absence of that talk in white families tells you something about what messages the kids are getting, and understandably so, okay? I'm not saying ununderstandably so, about what they have to look forward to out there, what it's going to be like out there, how dangerous it possibly is. I want to call your attention to a YouTube, if you have a chance to go to either write it down or get it from the web here. There's a young woman in New York, about 7 years ago, 10 years ago maybe now, who did her own little recreation of the Kenneth Clark and Mamie Clark studies on dolls. And what she found, I mean, it wasn't a controlled study and all of that, but what she did was she videotaped these young black children in Harlem with the doll situation. And it basically, she has that on this video that's called A Girl Like Me. There's some other interesting things on that video too. It's about 15 minutes. But what she's demonstrating there is that same business of a young child saying, black is not as pretty, white is smarter, white is better. I would rather be playing with a white child. Oh, but the black doll is the one that looks like me. That whole thing is still going on, right? It's still out there, it's still in the media, it's in the air that kids breathe. So now that is a chronic kind of telling you about your worthlessness. Then when you go on and you have an experience that tells you that directly because it's life-threatening, it adds to the difficulty in healing from that. And I want to just put into the mix here this concept of microaggressions. Have people heard of that? So microaggressions are these kind of daily small events that particularly people of color or people who are somehow identified as being different from the mainstream get as part of their daily lives. Oh, you're so articulate, right, to a black person, right? These are like little jabs that tell you the world is not safe, right? And that's what we're talking about. So we're talking about big things that tell you the world is not safe, little things. And this issue of trust that was mentioned is really critical to this. You don't know what the intention is, particularly of people who represent authority. And again, I want to go back to this notion of this can come black on black. as well as white on black, right? This kind of thing about telling you're not really worth much comes from a lot of sources, and that makes it much harder to kind of pick yourself up and say, oh, but I can do well, the world is going to treat me well, I'm going to, things are going to work out. And I always have this up there, but at this time in history, this business of undocumented immigration status is a huge issue, because that's like living with a chronic level of impending trauma. This whole anticipatory anxiety about if you speak to the wrong person, you meet up with the wrong person. So these are kids who are walking around with this chronic fear that they're going to be deported, their parents are going to be deported, they're not going to know where family members are. Okay, and then we have this whole question of that, so let's say you're traumatized, you're stressed out. What are our services available for these kids? And being marginalized makes it harder to get the services you need. Okay, so Ken Hardy, who's a psychologist in New York, has written about what he calls racial trauma, and he talks about the idea that kids, because of the things we've talked about, grow up with an internalized devaluation, belief that they're not really good, and hypervigilant about being respected. This whole thing about being dissed and killing somebody over being dissed is, he makes that link. An assaulted a sense of self, not really knowing who you are, where you come from, what your identity is about, and a sense that you're not entitled to express that experience. So an internalized voicelessness, and he calls those three a wound of rage, and he has, he's written a book about particularly working with teens, black teens, around a lot of these issues. Because frankly, I don't think we're ever going to get our work done around trauma just by fixing the kids who've been traumatized. We really need to look at what's happening to them. And we need to do it proactively and systemically, because it keeps happening. So this is my comment about resiliency, okay? It's clear, the literature is clear that, if there's protection, if there's a supportive people, if those people come into play, kids do better after traumatic events. It reduces the negative impact of trauma and chronic stress. But people in communities that have long histories of oppression have developed coping mechanisms, like this business about telling somebody what to drive, how to drive if you stop, or how to react if you're stopped by the police. Or even that mother in the bank. That's a coping mechanism. So one of the things we have to be aware of as professionals coming in here is some of those behaviors, like for example, the bank thing. If you're a white professional looking at that, often the reaction, or a white influence professional, however you want to say this, you're looking at that. That looks like the parent is overly controlling. It looks like the parent is not allowing the child to explore. Not allowing the child to explore is typically seen as being associated with decreasing intellectual curiosity. You're keeping the kid tight. But that's a coping mechanism to deal with trauma in the larger community, historically and in the present. So how do we, and I'm raising this as a question that I think has to be asked, how do we change that dynamic in a way that's realistic? Because you can't ask people to drop their coping mechanisms that keep them and their children safe, right? You can't just say, well, do it differently, right? This is a real problem. And I think, therefore, it's critical to really any attempts to address systemic sources of trauma to involve members of the community who can speak to what I'm exactly saying much better than I can, who can tell you why they do that way, why they rely on a lot of physical punishment, which is another big thing, between professionals and working with families. Don't hit your kid. And I'm not a proponent of hitting your kid. But there's reasons why that has evolved that way. And so I think we really need to have those conversations, not just among professional people, but involving people in the communities that we're concerned about. So, whoops, I lost it there, sorry. Now we're on the slide. Well. this is my last slide. So I just want to say that trauma and chronic stress impact poor people and people of color to greater degrees than they do economically comfortable people and white people. So I think if we're going to move forward in a collective way, we really have to look at the sources of trauma and stress and look at how race and poverty play a role in that. And it really brings us into systemic concerns as well as individual concerns. And people who are doing this work have to have an increasing understanding of this, I think, of these systemic issues. The ways in which these systems work, the ways in which the gatekeepers in the systems work, as teachers, social workers, psychologists, probation officers, what have you. How do we, who work in the system, those of us who do, what are we doing that's keeping the system moving in the same way? And what could be done differently in each of those systems? And then I think particularly as a psychologist, in the context of psychological treatment, once a kid is traumatized, we have to focus on the experience of race as a core issue among Black people and the lack of adequate attention for white professionals and probably professionals in general to the issue of race and poverty, I would say. So that's it. I'm finished. Oh, so I have an advertisement on the next slide, actually. I have no financial interest in this, just an emotional one. So if you're interested in that training, just send me an email.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Eskelin, in particular for bringing further attention to the disparate experience of both historical and contemporary trauma and chronic poverty by different ethnic racial groups, namely African Americans. And it's so important given that much of the trauma literature in psychology, as is true of most of the psychological literature in general, focuses on predominantly white samples and treats race and ethnicity as a nuisance factor often. So we need to see more of this conversation happening both at the public level and in the academic research level. So I'd like to open it up now to about 10 minutes of audience Q&A, and we probably have time for about 3 to 4 questions. I ask that when I call on you, you please just state your name and affiliation before providing your question. All right.
Question. Good morning. Hello, Susan. My question is to you. What's your next Undoing Racism weekend? Do you still have it at U of D again?
We just had one in March.
You just had it?
But the New York people have trainings in the New York area at least once a month, often more than that. In Jersey, we're anticipating another one in the fall. We don't know whether it's going to be in Newark or Jersey City.
There's one at the end of May. I looked it up. The end of
in
May.
New York.
In New York. End of May.
Yes, sir.
Good morning, my name is Bill Davis. I work with schools all over the state, so I'm really interested in this idea of, particularly I work in many of the avid districts. So it's the issue of concentrated stress in communities that are poor. And so I'm curious if there are any models that any of you may be familiar with that are bringing some possible solutions or helping children and families. And I think about the Harlem Children's Zone, that they have wraparound services for families. So are there models that all of us will benefit by knowing, that are providing some type of resource? Because the likelihood of the families getting out of poverty seems very small. And so what can we do to assist those families that are trying to cope and provide for themselves and their children?
Well, I don't know a model, so let me start by saying that I don't have an answer. But I do want to say that one of the things that I've, again, learned from the undergraduate is the importance of not viewing these communities as without internal resources. That there's a tendency for us to get together as professionals and come up with a plan that we think will work with them. And that just furthers the current problem. So there's got to be bringing people together, people who have this kind of professional expertise, but also people out there. There's a lot of strong, resilient people and families in those communities. And so we need them in this discussion to create whatever models need to be created. I think we tend as professionals to go into this professional sphere like we have the answers. You know, I've heard somebody point out two things I'll just say to start. One is that when women, and still to this day, are fighting for their rights, no one dares to say, or barely, that women don't know how to do these things, right? But when we talk about people of color, we kind of say people of color just don't know how to run their lives. We kind of take in that model that they don't know how to do it, and therefore we have to tell them to do it. In fact, the most successful parts of the war on poverty were parts that gave the direction and control to local community groups. So that, to me, is really a critical piece. We need to understand the trauma. We need to understand what it does to people. But the solutions, we have to look beyond just the professional.
Hi, Carrie Hentz. Thank you for your expertise. It's fabulous. I don't think that we can talk about trauma in schools and poverty without at least a pitch to the frontline people who address it, and that is the need to support through education, but also validation and affirmation the teachers in the classrooms. Without the resources, first they need to hear that showing up every day is heroic. Then they need to know that this is an issue that we know they're dealing with. And then how do we support them to be open to see when a child has been affected by trauma and receptive to it to get them to the right place. So the teachers are our frontline army, and how do we support them through services and validation and affirmation? And that needs to be part of it.
I think that subject's going to come up more in the second and third panel.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question.
It's actually for you, Dr. Slopen. Question is, you talked about social intervention.